Welcome to Sean's Thoughts with Shawn with a W. Thank you for joining me today. I truly do appreciate everything and all the attention, and I am fully grateful for every expression of blessings that God has provided me and our beautiful, beautiful natural world. So, you've seen actually, before we get into that, right now we're looking at some celery, and if you've listened to my audios for any duration of time, I often talk about celery and its importance, and of course, love, and what we're watching on the screen right now. So, giving you something other than just a static image to look at, I thought I would put on my iPad to show my Foresee series. So, definitely, if you're interested, I'll link a playlist at the end of this video. And yeah, the Foresee series is a series I created to spend more positive time just contemplating the possibilities of tomorrow rather than what's out there on the news to essentially confuse us in fear so that we perhaps don't act. And that's what leads me to the headline that I wrote today. See, I thought my channel was always going to be positive information or perhaps spiritual information, but I've been guided to share a different perspective today. And this perspective is one of talking about our natural world. And actually, I started this podcast or this particular live stream on the 10th hour at the 11th minute on the 12th day of the 12th month, of course, because today being the 12/12, which many people talk about it being the 12/12 portal. But my talk today is to discuss essentially what I've seen coming into the headlines. See, I watch a lot of different channels, and I often trust that and I say trust some, but I often trust that headlines or videos put into my feed for a reason. And although I've essentially blocked out a lot of the mainstream news feeds, I often get in other streams of news and I share them with you. And one of them that I've been getting into my feed, perhaps because I reside in Canada, is news to do with the Canadian banks. Canadian banks such as the Toronto Dominion. And actually, I'll highlight that. I'm really meaning the banks that reside in Canada, that operate in Canada, because Toronto Dominion, TD Bank, is no longer Canadian. It was bought out previously by American banks. I think it was First National or something in America. And a lot of the other banks, perhaps, I'm not sure of their full ownership. However, in the news headlines, we have been seeing a lot to do with the Toronto Dominion Bank and different issues there, and I won't go into it. You can easily see it yourself. And I've seen things recently, just today, with the Bank of Montreal also having problems, and the Royal Bank had their problems. And one of the interesting things that I looked into previously when I ventured into looking to the banks is the names of the banks, and perhaps I'll explain that later, because now that I'm thinking about it, I'm not actually able to bring up those exact words that I'd learned. But I looked at like the Canadian Imperial was a key word, and then the Toronto Dominion was a key word, and then Bank of Montreal. The word Montreal has a meaning which isn't off the top of my head right now, and of course the Royal Bank of Canada. They all have a connection to something that is not necessarily Canadian. Anyways, and so I kind of wondered, like, why am I talking about this? Why do I talk about this topic? And then just as I set up my camera and I put this video on for you guys to watch, and as I said, the video is about seeing something better than what we're being led to believe is happening. See, there's a lot of fear within the comments of these videos that are talking about these different potential collapses and issues, and banks being sued or fined by the SEC, and the Federal Reserve doing this and that and all that lovely stuff. And there's a lot of fear and there's a lot of concern. Actually, the comments are pretty intense when it comes to people's perception of what's happening. And of course, when you're unaware that there are other, perhaps, groups or initiatives already in play in order to prevent perhaps a said collapse or around the banks. Actually, these banks are in the headlines as well, if you look a little bit deeper than the mainstream. Nonetheless, the world banking system seems to be, well, it seems to be being called into question, and many people have different theories and ideas of what is happening. However, the reason why I'm creating this audio is because I guess I wanted to essentially help or contribute to decreasing the amount of fear, because remember, fear only creates more fear. It does nothing else other than that. So when we speak or comment and express those fears, we essentially share and spread those fears, and then it can possibly, well, I don't want to project, but it can get out of control. So I guess my intention, or I can say God's intention of me creating this particular podcast, is to help dissolve those fears, not with evidence or facts or, all this stuff. It's just simply to perhaps look at or reframe, just like I did with the Amazon leaving Quebec situation. Not to say that I was successful, but at least that was my perspective at the time. To perhaps look at these events that are happening, that are transpiring, and perhaps look at them a little bit differently. And see, what I see is that I'm aware that there is an organization called the Federal Reserve in America, and the Federal Reserve does a lot of, or did do a lot of things for the money system, or the debt slavery system, as some would call it. And you see, the Federal Reserve was never federal. See, the Federal Reserve's the information that I have about the formation of the Federal Reserve, which happened sometime in 1918 or sometime after the Titanic, and how we link the Titanic into this whole conversation, but it happened sometime after the sinking of the Titanic. See, my understanding, or my knowledge, will say knowledge perhaps mixed with some wisdom, because I'm still continuing to talk about this, is that there were an elite group of people who boarded the Titanic that lovely day, and actually there was a gentleman who was meant to be on that ship. His name was J.P. Morgan, or he represented that family anyways. So the Morgan person at the last minute got off of that boat, but yet there were several other influential bankers on that ship when that ship departed. Some even say it wasn't the actual Titanic, but it was the sister ship of the Titanic that had known problems. But regardless of all that, one of the richest people on the planet also boarded that ship that day, and supposedly he was against the formation of the Federal Reserve. See, the Federal Reserve, as I said, it was not federal. It was a creation or an agreement of the money systems to be created, and the beings, or the people that essentially sunk in with the Titanic, were people that were against the formation of the Titanic. However, after the Titanic sunk, the Federal Reserve was quickly created. Now, the Federal Reserve, from my understanding, is not an organization that's federally run by the American government. Actually, it seems to be, or I've come to the understanding of it. See, I watch how I say things, so I realize that some people feel or hear when I say things as facts, yet I'm not trying to express facts. I'm just simply trying to relay information, and perhaps, there might be someone who can corroborate what I'm saying from their own first-hand experience, that would be awesome. Anyways, the Federal Reserve is an organization that is throughout the world, and they did a lot of things for the world's money. And not all of those things were positive. And so this organization had or has large control over a lot of the world's money printing and anything really to do with money. And anyway, so a lot of these banks that we see that are in different countries, well, they're all essentially under the Federal Reserve, as I understand it. And even many of these Canadian banks that we have, the situations that are in the news right now, they have been ongoing for a very, very long time. And more importantly, these banks aren't Canadian banks per se. I've seen, well, I've been in a Bank of Montreal in Beijing. I've been in a Bank of Montreal in Chicago. I've been in a bank of the Scotiabank in Belize. I think it was Belize. But anyways, these banks are all throughout the world. And our understanding of the banking system is considerably different than we ever imagined. And that has helped me understand that a lot of the fees and stuff that we pay at banks to transfer money, for example, all of that's essentially just created in order to give them another reason to collect money back from the little bit that they allowed us to have for all the work that we've done. And so, with that being said, I understand that fear can come because our investments and our livelihoods, we believe, are all within those four walls of the banks that we have our money in. However, I've come to understand that each of our, essentially, the money that we have has been backed up. It has been mirrored. I'm not going to go too much into detail, but I do feel and I do trust that the money that we do have within the bank, and I use the word money specifically because money is a debt instrument as opposed to currency. The money that's in the bank is, in a sense, protected. Not protected by a government, or I don't really want to start that sentence off with not, but nonetheless, I have been reassured by the director of the Global Intelligence Agency that our money that's within those privately owned corporations, that it is protected. So for perhaps just that can be enough to alleviate concerns. And yet for some, that won't be enough. So I definitely recommend that you venture yourself over to their reports and check the information out for yourself. However, I'm simply adding my frequency to calming the collective so that we perhaps don't project and thus create any sort of difficulties that we therefore then have to experience. So, are the banks collapsing? Well, honestly, in a sense, they already have. And therefore, there isn't as much to be concerned with. The amount of inflation around the world has already turned so much upside down. Many countries have had their money completely inflated. Like, for instance, Japanese currency, they use a 10,000 yen for their $100 kind of idea, and we have $100. And at one point in time, that wasn't the case. It's just their currency after the war was definitely deflated. Same thing with Korea and with Iraq and Venezuela. Like, many, many countries' currencies have been completely devalued in order to control how the world's banking system happens. And all of these banks that we deal with day to day, they have, in a sense, been complicit, not necessarily knowingly, like, not that they were themselves doing it, yet the Federal Reserve was definitely a player within that. And, well, overall, many countries have already experienced this massive inflation, and they survived through it. And I want to underline that. They survived through it, just as whatever comes against us or whatever resistances we or opposition that we have oppose us or try to bring us down, we will I don't want to say survive, because we're going to do so much better than that. We are going to thrive. See, these organizations, that these banks, were all part of a debt slavery system that was essentially meant to keep us down. They provided things like mortgages with inflated rates and high interest rates, although we see it as being low. Like, they sell us on the idea that 4% or 5% or whatever it is they try to sell you, they try to tell you that, that's a low rate. When, if you take your calculator and you add up how much interest you are paying and what the true value of your house is once you finish paying it, you'll see that, or at least I did, that you essentially end in a deficit. You end in paying more than you actually gained. And people always talk about, well, if I buy a house, then at least I have an asset. Well, and equity, or whatever excuses they want to try to contrive, or they've been programmed to try to relate. And yet, if you look at it, when you sell a house, you sell it in that same market. And so, for instance, in Canada, if you're not aware, our housing market in the last 10 years is essentially more than doubled value. And you'll see a lot of news to do with money laundering and massive forced inflation. And our own prime minister, our previous prime minister, he actually canceled a policy that basically deterred foreign investment to a certain percentage and allowed our Canadian market to be open up to foreign investors. And many of the homes that are now in Canada are empty. And while we have an ongoing issue with, homelessness, we have so many overpriced rental houses and houses that were bought for investment by foreign investors that are essentially empty. We could, and I truly do believe this, take every homeless person in Canada and give them an apartment. Not give them, but we could house them in apartments that currently remain vacant. And even on, like, maybe I'll do a video on this, because I had on one of my streets, or like on a street called Lougheed Highway, which is a highway. It's not like a main Trans-Canada highway, it's a smaller highway. However, there are actually, I believe, 10 to 12 vacant lots where perfectly good homes once stood, and yet these houses were bought for the idea of land, land assemblies or project, like, anyway, bought by investors or whatever we want to call those people, but greedy organizations. And then they tore down the houses just so they could avoid any sort of higher tax by allowing the land to remain empty until they got all their ducks in a row and sold them to developers. Now, years later, and I do mean years later, as the economy slows down, we'll say, they remain empty. And see, I want to point this out. The reason I'm talking about all this is, for one, mortgages, or the collapse of the mortgage market, which is in the news media right now, and you can easily see that by the numerous amount of properties that are available for sale, that this is all contributed to by these banks. By these banks who allowed all of these mortgages to go through their doors. They gave us iPads and they gave us all this other stuff for us to redo our mortgages, or to, get the mortgages overall. And they gave a lot of free gifts in order to push this whole idea of, we're getting a good deal. And yet now, 2 years after the crazy boom of buying condos, for example, now there's thousands and thousands of condos across Canada that were just recently built that remain empty. And even still, with all this happening, they're still trying to start new projects. It just makes me laugh. However, I was told, or perhaps guided to understand by God, that perhaps the reason for this is these homes will eventually be given away, because everyone on earth, every Homo sapien on earth deserves a safe, comfortable, dry roof over their head. And I totally believe that. I see one day that there will be a perhaps what word did I a rebalancing of poverty. And what I mean by rebalancing, I mean if you don't want to be poor, that there will be a home for you to live in. I've heard about different initiatives to doing with restructuring the way that banks are once the genetic shareholders of the banks are no longer there, as I've been informed by the global intelligence agency's reports. And that these banks, in a sense, are, yes, collapsing. However, just as I had mentioned in the report to do with Amazon leaving Quebec and Canada, there are a lot of positive highlights on this. For example, as I've been mentioning, a lot of those mortgages that were taken out on homes, the actual value of the home was severely inflated. And people working their entire lives to pay off a 25-year or 30-year mortgage and eventually actually truly funding CEOs and private royal bloodlines with all of those interest payments and the actual value of the homes themselves. When I first came to my city, I actually looked at a home that was just recently built, and it was built exceptionally well. Unlike a lot of these cheap, generic, box-like worker condos, it was a townhouse that they were asking for just under $300,000. Well, this particular condo went on sale for almost $1 million recently. And well, I could have said, oh my gosh, I earned so much money. The actual thing is I wouldn't have. Because if I had sold that condo for whatever, I still would have had to buy into the exact same market. And that's a lot of the reason why we have experienced these last 5 years of an inflated market. This inflated market was only propped up by people selling their homes in Vancouver and, for example, a bigger, major city, and then buying much further out. I knew people that lived here and then moved to Kelowna to buy because it was considerably cheaper, and that left them with a large amount of capital that they could then use for other things. And many people ended up using those things for, that excess capital for things, for products that were made overseas, for vacations and going out drinking, and essentially infusing that money back into the system. And yet at the end of the day, yes, their property went up in value, but also did their taxes, also did their upkeep, because a lot of these homes were made with inferior materials. And so coming back to what I had said before and how I started off this whole conversation is, well, were the banks responsible? Yes, the banks were not responsible, but they were definitely partially responsible. And now they are facing the consequences of what they did and how they were organized and structured, and the people that were involved in pushing, insane mortgages, $1 million mortgages with yes, 0.1 or some low interest rate. But that interest rate could have been variable. It could have been whatever it was. Regardless, every 5 years, these mortgages are or have to be refinanced. And of course, now that we're in a market where the interest rates are different from what they once were, and well, we're experiencing turmoil. We're experiencing different investigations going on because essentially the media, and that's the reason for a lot of the fear, the media has to push a narrative that we can understand that connects partially to the truth, yet essentially conceals a lot of the actual information behind how and why this essentially started. So perhaps this was the reason, and the outcome essentially will be perhaps a world without that financial dominance of the banks around our necks. Because one of the actually I want to add one thing back into it because this is a really cool fact, and this kind of reassures, and that's the real reason I create these thoughts, that there's a bill, I mean there's a number on the any of the bills, and you can go and look at it, and it's on both sides, at least here in Canada. However, every single dollar bill, $10 bill, whatever it is, every note, which by the way, it actually says on the older versions, I'm not sure about the newer versions in your country, that it's not legal tender, but every note has what they call well, there's a number on it, and I understand that to be called the allocation number. Now that allocation number is not only on the bills that you carry in your pocket, it's also on the actual money that you put into the bank. So that allocation number gives that bill its unique identity. And see, in the past, the banks, they had the ability to rob Peter and pay Paul. And if you understand what I mean by, and if you don't understand what I mean by that statement, it means that they could essentially, through something called fractional banking, they could take a majority of the money that you deposited, and then they could lend that out to someone else. And then when that person deposited their money that they were just receiving from you, for instance, if they were buying your home and they had actual cash and they put that money into the bank, or if they had a mortgage and they put that money into the bank, well, then the bank could turn around and take a large portion of that money and lend it out and continue that scheme until essentially the banks really didn't have the assets in order to bank all of the debt that they had lent out. And so that has been stopped. And that's the large reason of why we've seen an insane amount of inflation as well as controversy when it comes to the banks overall. Meaning that a lot of the organizations who claim that they actually have the money couldn't actually pay back what they have out or what people have put into the banks. Now, I'm not putting that out there to scare. As I had said, that I do believe and I trust that there are systems and initiatives already in place in order to protect that. So trying to take a whole bunch of money out of the bank isn't necessarily going to help anything. It'll simply possibly cause, and we don't want that. We want to have a civil transition. We want to have people engage and strengthen their awareness of what truly is happening. And actually right now, you see in the images that are up on the screen, these are dedication images that I co-created with an AI to do just that. These are images from United News Network that I had kind of used their backdrop in order to co-create kind of, I don't know. Anyways, if you watch some of the older situation reports, you definitely, and perhaps be able to see the relation. So anyways, as I was saying, there are initiatives out there. However, I do truly feel that every bit of chaos that is allowed to come into our fields, to come into our consciousness, is there for a reason. It's there to nudge us more and more awake. And I know many of the people are waking up, and that's essentially why a lot of what we're seeing, we're seeing. We're seeing it because the matrix, the system, the simulation, the world, like they can't truly stop us from waking up any longer. They knew this a long time ago. They knew this back when they created the Treaty of Versailles, and they gave in 1918, and they gave the controls of the world's militaries to, well, private companies or private families. They knew this a long time ago that this would happen. And a lot of these initiatives, like creating the Federal Reserve, were an initiative in order to, walk us towards what's happening in the world right now. And there's a lot of people that are living in fear because they believe that things are ending, when I see things as beginning. I see this as the fall of the old structures that kept us binded into a narrative that kept maintained our enslavement. You know, there's a story where 400 years of enslavement affected the black people of America, for example, when the truth of it is that we all have been enslaved. And regardless if we have these ideas of, well, it's just because we didn't know how to manifest our reality and all these lovely stuffs. And, you know, to me, that's the same thing as the Adam and Eve story that essentially blames Eve for what had happened, when in fact, we have been controlled for a very long time, and we are now awakening up. This God is strengthening his connection, her connection, its connection. Source is strengthening their connection with us. And we are regaining our ability to essentially co create with Source. And so things like this banking incident, and I'm going to label it onto that incident, this story, this narrative, this propaganda that they're trying to, you know, spark whatever agendas that they have, won't be happening. We have moved beyond that. We are stronger than that. And so, with all that being said, I trust, I hope, I know, and we are realizing that we are okay. We are fine. We have the knowledge and the know how to do so much, and there are so many different, like I said, initiatives, and it's kind of up to you to go out there and find them. I talk about them, and whether or not you decide to open that door and seek that possibility, that's kind of up to you, because that's the one thing God gave us through all this trials and tribulations and multiple apocalypse and all this stuff that we've experienced throughout our past incarnations. God had given us free will. And though they did their best to overlay our consciousnesses, to control our perception, to actually program us with entertainment and Hollywood narratives and who did this and who's buying what and all this lovely stuff, basically to drown our attention in a pit of confusion, we have always had the ability to see, if we chose to see, and holding ourselves accountability for, well, what we chose is something that, you know, many of us are going to have to do. Holding ourselves accountable for the choices we made and working towards, perhaps, you know, however you want to see it, forgiveness. Forgiveness for others, forgiveness for ourselves, forgiveness for, well, perhaps even the deep state. Perhaps even forgiveness for the bankers and the oil companies. Who knows? But if we are able to essentially increase our awareness of what's happening in the world and do this without spreading fear, without sharing those fear porn headlines, without sharing those, you know, stories and narratives that are meant to purposely create fear, and we reframe that report that we're watching into a positive way. Companies leaving companies leaving Canada. Yesterday in the new headlines, Starbucks closed over 200 of its locations. From what I understand in the headlines, that there was no real notification, that it simply just happened and stores were closed. Well, that creates a lot of fear, yes, but it's also positivity, because now those cafes that are already set up to be cafes can be opened by 200 independent people who believe that they can run their own business. There's many restaurants, like there was this restaurant that I talked about the other day, that there was an A&W in a food court, and the A&W closed, and it remained there for over a year, and then the Butter Chicken Kitchen opened up there, and there's a family essentially selling their own home cooking. And so there's a lot of opportunities. Now, yes, when these banks close, and they will close, we saw it ourselves. HSBC was one of the first banks in Canada to collapse, and they moved out of Canada, and places essentially moved into the buildings, different businesses and such. But those buildings now will be there, just as the houses and the condos and the townhouses and all of the other structures, they will be there for when all of that does eventually fall to ruin. What I'm meaning, not the houses, but the actual organizations and the developers and all the foreign-owned equity funds that own all that stuff, when they're all gone, those homes will essentially become property of your local communities, in my opinion. Actually, not just my opinion. I've been led to know this, to real like I've been led to truly feel that this is the way that it's going to be, and there will be a redistribution, not only of wealth but of equal living for all Homo sapiens. And I trust that this will be the case. And so I hope you have gained some more steady, steadfast footing in this. And as I said, try not to be drawn into the news headlines and the worry and concern, and trust that God, not the Christian God, not the Islam God, not the, I'm using a lot of the words nots, but not the religious figurehead that they put into religion, yet God, the source of all things, is here, has always been, and, well, we're now transitioning into a new reality, a new, perhaps, existence. How fast it will come, who knows? However, in order to take the most amount of souls with us, actually, I'll use the word bring, the old structures have to fall. There's a saying in Chinese, let me remember, Ruguo Jiu Bu Chu Xinde Bu Lai. And that means if the old don't go, the new don't come. Well, I truly do believe that although that was a propaganda, in my opinion, in order to get people to allow the destruction of their old history, it does show us, especially in this point of time, that if these old structures that actually enslaved us, and banks do enslave us, then the new world, new earth, new Eden, whatever it is that you would like to call it, the fifth density, the fifth 5D, the new world, whatever it is, that the old has to fall in order for all of that to arise. So with that being said, I love you. Share the love, share the messages that I share if possible. If you're called to, of course, visit other broadcasts such as the ones that I've been showing to you with all these co-created images that I personally created, not as in a digital art designer that I told the AI that I was working with. His name's Jasper. I told Jasper AI the images, what I wanted to see, and it did its best to translate my words, my ideas, my thoughts, and essentially it worked as a whole entire team of creative people that essentially helped me create these images. And, share your attention on my Foresee series. Share your attention on sharing it with others. And together we will ripple ourselves, and we will ourselves walk on water. Because a lot of what we see out in the world, it's simply a perception, an illusion, and we are waking up to real reality. Thank you so much for joining me. Thank you so much for sharing your oh my gosh, there in the middle of winter there's this hummingbird just floating in front of me right now, about 4 feet away. Its head is just flipping side by side. Oh, it's coming closer. Oh, now it's gone. I guess it was looking for food or something like that, but I love seeing hummingbirds this close. I often do. Anyways, thank you so much again. God bless you. I bless you. Love blesses you. Every unicorn, every divine creature that is around us, the dragons, I'm sure we're all blessing each other. And, as Carrie said, we're all walking each other home. I love that statement. And yeah, much love. Have a wonderful, wonderful 12 days to come.